Okay, so far we've been doing really rules-based, very narrow assignments, using 10 brushstrokes to make a painting. That's not very real world. The reason I assigned that was to force you to work in a way that was intentionally uncomfortable, because it makes you look at something and think really carefully between each brushstroke you make. This is good. That's a great habit to get into. What you should do is carry that discipline into something where there aren't any rules. So that's what we're going to do here. The final assignment is to capture the essence of a photo. I'm going to be using color, although you can use black and white. It's up to you. And you don't have to follow any of the rules we've been following so far, but those skills are going to make this so much easier. Now I'm going to speed up this process a tiny bit here and put narration over the top. Don't rush when you do this assignment. You're training yourself to look, and you don't want to train yourself bad habits. Speed is just a side effect of experience. So take your time with this and focus on those values. Just like before, we're starting with a line drawing, its own layer. But as you can see with this reference, it's really one major silhouette. And because the silhouette is such an important graphic element, I've actually gone one step further, and instead of just doing a line drawing tracing, I'm actually using the pen tool to create a path. Now, what does this do? All this gives me is the ability to have a clean silhouette that I can draw inside of. What it leaves me with is a nice selection. With that selection, I can make a group, and then I can just apply that selection as a mask to the group. Now I don't have to worry about painting inside the lines. And in this assignment, as I mentioned, I don't think there's any rules. There's no limited numbers of brush strokes, no specific number of values, but I'm going to remember all those principles. So the first steps here are to really lock in those crucial graphic values. This is kind of the initial read. And it's from these major values that I'm then going to refine and subdivide and get all the details. But I really can't overstate just how important this step is. So you'll actually see me taking kind of longer pauses between these brush strokes. And that's just because I'm looking at it. And I'm thinking, how does it look compared to my reference? Am I getting the right values? This is a good moment to adjust and instead of locking in a bad value. After establishing the major values of the background, now I have to pick the next crucial value, which is the value of the deer. This relationship, the contrast between background and character, is really the heart of this particular composition. So if I get it wrong here, I'm going to have a lot of problems moving forward. So I'm kind of fussing around and trying to figure out what's the right value, because I also want it to relate to this ground plane. Because this right here is essentially the entire composition. I'm going to be adding details and adjusting relationships, but this is the foundation. With that in mind, now it's time to start subdividing. And here's where the contrast range really matters. So I'm working within the generally light block of the sky, and I'm moving it a little bit lighter and a little bit darker, trying to figure out what is that right contrast relationship between the clouds and the blue sky. And it is so easy to make this too much. I think the primary lesson of this, honestly, is keeping subtle value relationships intact. So I'm kind of thinking about cool cloud shapes and activating the background and making it more of an interesting space, but I still don't want to let that contrast get out of hand. Now as I start to define the interior shapes inside the deer, I'm going to start from biggest to smallest. So once again, I'm going to have to be careful not to exaggerate that contrast, but I'm going to make the light fur and the dark fur as kind of the major breakdown of shapes in here. So I have to kind of figure out how much lighter is that light fur. And then I'm going to try and simplify that shape as much as I can. It's easy to look at all the details in the fur and overcomplicate things, but here I'm trying to think as graphic and simple as I can. And I got a little too light, so I'm actually going to darken it down right now. I think that's looking a little bit better. So here I have taken one large shape and begun to subdivide it into the smaller subshapes. When adding in a slightly darker value here, it's the same deal. How can I use stroke economy, and how can I simplify these interlocking shapes while retaining kind of a narrow value range? Now, as I get to the smaller and smaller shapes, the face is inevitable. This is one of those really dangerous areas of any image that includes a person or an animal. we gravitate towards faces. And what that means is we might exaggerate the size of the shapes, almost like a caricature drawing. Or here, since I already have the line drawing locked in, where I could still be in danger is the value range. So because I think face and I can really relate to it as a human, I might accidentally add too much value change to the eyes and the patterning and the nose. It's really easy to go too far here. So this is one of those areas where you have to pay extra close attention to what am I actually looking at? Look at the photo. Don't rely on your memory of a deer and, go back to that icon of a deer in your mind. Stick to the reference. Limit those values. Now at this point, it's time to start making some adjustments. I've gotten enough brush strokes in to kind of fill the whole canvas. So I'm going to start using adjustment layers to kind of rein it in a bit, experiment a little bit, tweak it, and see if I can get my values to feel more like the reference. So here I'm doing very subtle adjustments, and because the adjustment layer lives inside of this group, I'm only affecting the deer and I don't have to worry about going outside of the lines. So I kind of sit back and I look at the deer and I'm looking at the background, and I think the footing, kind of that transition zone between the cast shadow of the deer and the foreground grass is just not reading quite right. I think it's not quite dark enough. So here I'm going to make an adjustment layer that'll just kind of darken it down, but I'm not sure exactly where I want the transition. So in this case, I haven't shown you this, but I can actually blur the edge of that adjustment layer and I can shift it around here. I could have done this with a brush stroke. I really just wanted to have some flexibility in how those values transition from the foreground darkness to that lighter middle ground. And when I'm happy with all this, now I just go back to painting. So it's not to say once you do adjustment layers, you can't paint anymore. They just live in your layer stack. And here I continue to subdivide. I'm changing the shapes a little bit. I'm adding a little bit of silhouette detail to indicate the grass. And now it's time to kind of put in those leaves in the background. And this is a study. It's really about a deer. It's not about the field the deer is standing in. So I want to keep this as basic as possible. I think indication of detail is the name of the game here. I really don't want to spend a whole day on this painting. So I'm really just going to kind of use stroke economy and make as few marks as possible. So as I go through the home stretch here, I have sped up the video, but really there is nothing new about each of these brush strokes. Once I've established these large shapes and their value relationships, really all that's left is, the detailing. And you could take this detailing phase as much or as little as you wanted. In this case, my entire study took about 15 minutes, and so there's really not a whole lot of detailing happening here. But since there is a face, it's a deer looking at the camera, this is where I'm going to devote a little bit more of my energy. That's just, a little trick. If you have anything with eyeballs, just spend a little more time there. The rest of the image can kind of sort itself out with people's imagination, but they will look at the face. But the important thing to remember here is to be subtle and be careful with those value relationships. You can ruin all the careful work from the first half or 3/4 of your painting by adding in details that stand out because they have too much contrast. I think doing a photo study like this one, where it's kind of backlit, is a really great test of this. Because honestly, the deer has very little contrast. The deer has a lot more contrast to the background or to the grass, but all the internal shapes inside the deer, if you squint, they pretty much go away. And this is not the way we envision things. If we envision, the cartoon deer, all those shapes in the, pattern on its fur, these are all high contrast. So this is really a test of looking at the actual reference and keeping your values careful. Now, as a final touch, I'm going to put in those, little dots, those little white fur tufts, because, everything else underneath is in place. I don't have to worry about kind of retreading this territory. So it's safe to add those last minute details. But I think I'm happy to call this one done. It achieves what I set out to do and what I'm encouraging you to set out to do, which is to look at a photo, to figure out the essence, and then to break that down into simple values. All I'm doing is testing myself to see if I can really understand the general value breakdown of the image I'm looking at. Now, it's possible that you've watched this video all the way through and you haven't done any of the smaller homeworks yet. I strongly encourage you to do them in the order I suggested. I know it's going to be tempting to jump straight to this more traditional looking study, but what's really hard to communicate about the painting you just watched me do is how I'm internalizing the lessons from those earlier homeworks. I'm thinking about the 3 major values. I'm using a combination of brush strokes and adjustment layers. I'm subdividing within the major values into smaller and smaller details. All these things begin to happen automatically once you're experienced, but they're not going to happen automatically for you right now. And that's what the homeworks from earlier in the series are for. If you practice each of those elements on their own, it doesn't matter that the results don't look, pretty. These are things you're not going to show other people. But it helps you practice each of those skills and kind of internalize it, such that when you do these more developed studies, you're going to be able to employ all those techniques simultaneously. Now, it's going to take time to get these looking good, but it is time worth spending. So thank you so much for buying this series. I really appreciate your support of Control Paint, and have fun with your homework.